Hello, my name is Ethan Kwecki, and today I'll be giving a presentation on the temporary assistance for needy families and the impact it has had on families and children. To begin, I'll give a quick intro. First, what I'll cover is the history of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Family Act. Then I will talk about what it was intended to do when it was first signed into legislation, how it has affected mothers, how it has impacted children, and finally I will conclude by looking at how this welfare reform has impacted African American and Latino communities. So first, just a brief history on the origins of this bill. According to Rector, this bill was the result of many years of debates on welfare reform that were aimed at changing the welfare system so people would become less dependent on it by increasing and promoting education and retraining. Before this act, they felt that many people were becoming dependent on welfare and the system was not incentivizing people to get off of welfare and return to work. So after many years of debate, President Bill Clinton at the time in 1996 signed this into law, and it replaced the former welfare program, which was known as AFDC, or Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and that's according to Falk at the Congressional Research Service. So, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, there were 4 goals of TANF. This presentation will cover the first 2. The other 2 I will not mention. They're a whole nother topic for a different time. But the first 2 goals I will look at, and these are, the first goal was to provide assistance to children and as a way to ensure that children were raised in their homes with their families. And the second goal was to end welfare dependency and promote job creation and job training. The other 2 goals that I won't mention and talk about in this presentation, they set the goal to reduce out-of-wedlock pregnancy, realizing that this leads to increased rates of poverty. And their 4th goal was to encourage 2-parent families, because once again, the statistics have shown that 2-parent families experience less poverty, and having single-parent families strains families' finances greater than it would if there were 2 people in the family. So now I'll talk about some notable changes between the old system and the new system. The new temporary assistance for needy families gave states more control over how money was allocated. The idea behind this, according to the Congressional Research Service, was that states know their populations better and can better allocate money and funds to the people that need it, and in order to get those people back to work and off of welfare. They also added work requirements for people to be receiving benefits. This means that they have to have some type of work that they are doing and can prove. A portion of the funds were also designated to be used for education and training, so that was also geared to help get people back to work. Another thing that changed was the new system is now a federal grant, which poses some issues as the years go on. A grant allocates just a set amount of money, and this set amount of money doesn't grow if they don't vote to increase the budget, which they haven't. So therefore, the money that's been allocated has not kept up with inflation or changing poverty levels. An additional change was the federal government limited federal assistance to 60 months. States could offer welfare assistance in the TANF program past 60 months, but it had to come from the state budget. Once again, this is all according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and Congressional Research Services. So now let's look at the impact that this has had on mothers and families. So to begin, since this reform has been put into place, the participation in the welfare program fell by 60% from 1994 to 2004. Participation of single mothers represented a 16% decrease. Number of families living in deep poverty fell by 35% between this same time period, according to Ron Haskins. However, many critics of the welfare reform will point out that welfare caseloads were falling quicker at this time than the overall poverty rate, and that's a criticism by Germains in his article. So a lot of the problems you'll see with the new TANF welfare reform that critics will point out is that the welfare caseloads and the amount of people getting assistance has decreased quicker than the poverty rate. One of the reasons for this could have been because of the nature of the program being a grant, and that it cannot adjust to different poverty levels. So if the country goes into a recession and you still have the same amount of money to be allocated to those in poverty that you would have when your employment is 1%, when your employment jumps to 25, 30%, or your unemployment jumps to 25 or 30%, you'll have a lot less money to divvy out between a greater number of families. Finally, there was an interesting research article on the most effective way to get people to return to work, according to Kang and Fang, and they found that the most effective way to get people to return to work was not the work requirement, but rather a income tax credit. So now let's look at the effect on single mothers. So TANF has actually been pretty successful in looking at single mothers solely. Since the mid-90s, single mother employment has surged. 75 to 80% of single mothers have been employed since TANF has been instituted. However, Miller and Tashidi point out that there are roughly 3.3 million jobless single mothers and only 1.3 million families receiving welfare, known as TANF. So once again, you see that a lot of mothers are coming out of poverty and finding work, but TANF still has the problem that there are a lot of people still in poverty that don't receive the assistance, whether that's because of the nature of the grant not growing with the need and changing with the need and keeping up with inflation, or another option or another reason why you could see 3.3 million jobless mothers not receiving welfare is maybe the jobless mothers that don't receive welfare don't need the welfare if their ex-spouses or those paying child support make enough money to keep them out of that poverty level. So Miller and Tashidi didn't really touch on that article, but what I found when looking at census.gov is that 44% of single parents do receive full child support payments, and in the same article, census.gov said that around 65% of single parents receive some form of child support payments. So now looking at the impact the welfare reform has had on children. When the temporary assistance for needy families was originally enacted, 68 out of 100 families with children in poverty received benefits, and that's according to Patel. However, as of 2016, Patel gave a testimony in the House of Representatives, and at this time only 23 out of 100 children received benefits throughout the country. Because of the nature of TANF and allocating the decisions of where money goes to, the states have that power to choose where the money goes, and it differs widely across states. And this is one of the problems with the welfare reform is either wealthier states have more money to give out that passes the federal funding. So if, say, California runs out of federal funds that are given to them, they're more likely to be able to afford to take money out of their state budget and pump it into the temporary assistance for needy families program, where states like Louisiana or more poorer states can't really afford to do that, so they're left with the grant money that is awarded to them by the federal government. And Patel goes on to touch on this in her testimony when she says that 4 out of every 100 children living in poverty receive the funding in Louisiana, where 66 out of 100 children in poverty receive funding in California. So what has the impact been on minorities? According to John in her article, African Americans represent 12% of the U.S. population, but they make up close to 30% of the TANF welfare recipients. and that's according to 2015 federal data. Hahn goes on to state in her article that the largest proportion of African Americans and minorities live in states that are the least degenerate and abide by the strictest rules. What this has an effect on is that there's a lot of African Americans and minorities that are poverty stricken, but they do not receive funding. So you will be able to see this better in the next graph. So in this chart, which comes from Heather Hahn's article, Why Does Cash Welfare Depend on Where You Live? There's a chart that shows that the poverty ratios and the amount of people that receive funding. So at the very top, you can see Vermont, 78 out of 100 people that live in poverty receive TANF welfare funding. But as you get to the bottom, you can see states like Kentucky, South Dakota, Nebraska, Louisiana's in there, Texas is in there, Alabama, Arkansas. These states are the 25 states that have the highest African American and minority populations, but yet these states also give out the least amount of funding through TANF to those in poverty. So, for example, in Kentucky, 19 out of 100 people in poverty receive funding. So what this goes to show is that in these states with the largest African American and minority communities, there's a lot of people in poverty that don't receive funding. And once again, going back to that previous slide and how I talked about there are many African Americans on funding, but many more that still need it. So the way that TANF is distributed is adversely affecting these communities. So in conclusion, TANF is successful in some respects and fails in others. It's most successful at getting single mothers to return to work and getting them off of poverty. But various states' responses and attitudes towards welfare have a big impact on how it's distributed. And that's why you can see states like Alabama and Louisiana and Texas are either underfunded or don't distribute their TANF fundings to communities such as the African American communities and minorities, greatly affecting these populations. So here are my works cited.